Now, the idea of ghost ships haunts the collective memories of seafaring nations. Ships such as the Marie Celeste, which was discovered deserted and adrift in the Atlantic in 1872. Now, a mysterious shipwreck has been discovered off the east coast of Canada more than a century after it sank. Terry Egan reports.
Gordon Blackmore was out scanning for seabirds on the shores of Newfoundland when he saw a ghostly shadow in the water. Neither a bird nor a plane, it instead turned out to be a ship. Not any old ship, mind. This one is nearly 25 metres long and is a mystery, thought to date back to the 19th century. Here's Gordon's mum, Wanda.
Come in the door and he said, Mom, do you know of any shipwrecks down on the beach? I went, no. And then he showed me the video and took the pictures that he had taken. And I was like, Gordon, is that wooden dowels they're keeping it together? And he said, yes, Ma'am. I said, well, boy, that's probably at least 150 years old.
Cape Ray, near where the ship was found, is a coastal town of 350 people and used to be on a high-traffic shipping route. Residents there hope to find out more about how some of their ancestors might have been lost in the water, or, as Gordon put it, whether there are any lost souls still aboard. But depending on the wood involved, the ship could have been constructed entirely elsewhere, such as in Europe. As it stands, though, little more is known, neither about the ship nor about how it washed up. Neil Burgess is president of the Shipwreck Preservation Society.
Newfoundland really sticks out into the North Atlantic. It's battered by storms throughout the winter from the south and from the north. We get really huge surf and swells here in the ocean, and that's going to tend to uncover these things. The mythology with Newfoundland is that there's 10,000 shipwrecks around our shores.
Nor might this be the end of the ship's voyage. Hopefully it would become a place for remembrance, but could, instead, be damaged by sea ice or even dragged back out by the strong winds. Either way, it's likely to become a target for souvenir hunters, any of which threats might do vastly more damage than being submerged in the deep for 100 years or so.
Terry Egan.
Let's head to my homeland now, Scotland, where the discovery of a medieval ring by a metal detectorist got him thinking there may be a much bigger hole waiting to be found. But he had to wait 2 years until the farmer who owned the field harvested his carrots. The delay paid off, and Alan Baxter, the man behind the detector, ended up finding a lot more. Jacob Evans spoke to him about his discoveries.
I just couldn't move. There's finds everywhere. Kind of knew in that area would be good, but I didn't expect this.
Yeah, so in total you found more than 500 different pieces of stuff?
Yeah, from the Bronze Age to the medieval period, and most of it was in pristine condition. Grade A top examples.
So when you turned up to this field, was it just pinging off every 2 seconds?
Yeah, literally, just honestly, it was every 3 feet. It was, if it wasn't medieval artefact or coin, it was medieval lead, medieval molten copper.
It must be so surreal when you pick something up and to think, this hasn't been touched by another human for hundreds, if not thousands of years. What's that experience like?
You get a tingle up your spine, your hairs stand up on edge. It's just a fantastic feeling. You have to actually dig up an ancient artefact for yourself to experience that. It's just fascinating, especially an artefact that's personal, a personal possession, like, for example, the medieval ring. Somebody would have looked at that every day, like putting on a watch every morning, and it would have meant something to them. Once you find something that's relatively old, you've got that urge to keep going. You switch off and you just listen to the background drone in your metal detector headphones, and you just keep your head down and you just keep going. There's just the will to find something else. It just gets into your blood.
Have you always loved history?
No, I didn't. Ironically, you don't understand until you go out and find stuff for yourself, how it can change the way you feel about history and what you can learn as well along the way. You could go out and find something, I don't know, you find a medieval coin, you'll get a buzz from that straight away. You'll be just like, wow, I'm the first person to touch that for 700 years. It's just fascinating. I mean, so much has changed in that period of time. I mean, a lot's changed in the last 20 years, never mind in the last 2,000 years. It's amazing. I'd love to go back in time. I'd rather do that than win the lottery. I'd like to see what a medieval settlement looked like. You've got this wee picture in your mind, but to go back and see it would just be mind-blowing.
Alan Baxter.
Pioneering research has revealed a surprise at the heart of Stonehenge, the circular Neolithic monument in southern England whose origins are shrouded in mystery. The 6-ton altar stone, once thought to have come from Wales, was in fact transported from far further away from northeast Scotland. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh explains the significance of this discovery.
Stonehenge is one of the world's most famous prehistoric monuments. It was built 5,000 years ago, but essentially it's a stone circle with a horseshoe in its centre. Right at the centre is an altar stone. And people have wondered for hundreds of years what it's for, with no real answer. It's a kind of mysterious place. But the thought is that it was a place of worship and ceremony.
And the thought was that it had come from Wales, which is not a huge distance away from southwest England. But now this new analysis reveals that actually it came from far further away, from the north of Britain, from Scotland, 700 kilometres away.
Another Welshman who has found that it actually originated from Scotland.
And he's done this by analysing the rock and kind of sourcing where it comes from, because rocks from different regions have their unique fingerprint, if you like, almost.
So there are two things that you can do to rocks. I mean, rocks seem really boring to people, but they're actually fascinating because they tell us about the planet and also about Stonehenge in this case. So rocks have got their own unique composition and also their own unique dates. And you put the two of them together and it's like a fingerprint. But a fingerprint on its own is no good unless you have a fingerprint database. So the researcher, Anthony Clark, now works at Curtin University in Western Australia, who do have the best rock fingerprint database in the world. And they isolated it to northeastern Scotland in an area called the Orcadian Basin, which is more than 700 kilometres away. And it's a huge mystery as to how it could have been brought all this way. To drag it either by sledge or through logs or whatever is a huge undertaking. And one of his fellow researchers, Nick Pearce, was speculating as to how they might have done it.
They must have been very technically advanced to be able to do that, to bring it down by boat, bring it down on sledges or whatever.
And presumably it wasn't just a matter of engineering. There must have been some sort of social cohesion for the Scots and the Welsh and the English all to work together.
Absolutely. To bring this to here, a sort of focus in a way at that time, there must have been linking between all of these areas.
And Palab, do we have any idea why these people who brought this stone all the way from Scotland would have chosen to bring that rather than choosing one that's much nearer?
Well, that's the new question that's arisen. Clearly, it was very important for them. It was a Herculean effort, however they brought it along. But what it does show was just how connected the different parts of Britain were at the time. So in a way, it suggests that Neolithic Britain was in some way perhaps more sophisticated, more technologically advanced, and perhaps more connected than we previously thought.
Now, how did people thousands of years ago keep track of time and record important events? Archaeologists believe they've found what may be the world's oldest sun and moon calendar at a site in southern Turkey, dating back nearly 13,000 years. Symbols carved into pillars in the mountains of Anatolia are also believed to have recorded a comet strike that hit the Earth. Dr. Martin Sweatman from Edinburgh University told us more.
This site consists of lots of enclosures with lots of stone pillars. And on one of these stone pillars, one of the most sort of decorated stone pillars, there are these carvings. There is this, what we can interpret as a solar calendar, and it's encoded in terms of these geometric symbols. So we have these V symbols, and there are some small box symbols. And when we count them up, we can see that there is a lunar cycle. And then when we add all these different lunar cycles up and all the extra days, the extra V symbols, we can count an entire solar year of 365 days, which is quite remarkable. This would be the earliest known solar calendar by many thousands of years. On the same pillar, there are lots of animal symbols. There was this bird of prey symbol on the pillar, which was representing the summer solstice constellation. One of the few things we know about that time period is that this dramatic comet impact on Earth happened, and it's thought to have triggered all sorts of effects, such as extinctions of animals and climate change and so on. So it's the kind of thing that would have been remembered by the people at the time. And they probably built these constructions, these pillars and these enclosures, because they were motivated by perhaps a new religion or a cult that was sort of triggered by this comet impact event. The building of these grand structures would have encouraged people to gather around in the area to grow larger and larger communities. And so if our interpretation is correct, it means that this comet impact might have had an important role in the origin of civilization.
30 years ago, an idea dreamed up in the 17th century became a reality when the Channel Tunnel, linking Britain and France, officially opened. It laid the tracks for the Eurostar train service, which shuttles passengers from London to Paris and beyond, and the Eurotunnel, which carries vehicles and freight. The BBC's Mike Smart reported on the moment when the late Queen Elizabeth officially opened the tunnel in 1994, travelling to meet the then French president in Calais.
Her Majesty's train entered the tunnel at Folkestone to applause from those on board. Emerging half an hour later in France, where the President's train was waiting at the platform in Calais. Safety normally precludes two trains travelling on the same line in opposite directions, but today the French and British locomotives came to rest nose to nose, feet apart. Welcomed by her host, the Queen joined President Mitterrand in simultaneously cutting a ribbon, officially opening the under-channel link.
And that was Mike Smart, my first boss and a former BBC correspondent. Well, our current transport correspondent, Katie Austin, has more details about the anniversary.
Since the Queen made her journey through the Channel Tunnel, 480 million passengers have done the same. These days, 400 trains speed through it each day.
We're now going at about 120 kilometres per hour, which is roughly 75 miles per hour, and we're coming up to the middle of what is still the world's longest undersea tunnel.
Driver Martin has been here since the beginning.
People have this concept that it's just straight through to France, and it's totally not. The tunnel itself is up, down, round the corners and everything. It's no straight lines at all.
So you sort of know this tunnel like the back of your hand?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's like a second home, really.
Building it was an exceptional feat of engineering.
There are actually 3 tunnels. The one I'm standing in right now with my high vis and my hard hat isn't for trains. It's used for ventilation, access for maintenance and evacuating people in an emergency.
The tunnel carries a quarter of trade between the UK and the EU, plus plenty of holidaymakers, whether on the Eurostar to Paris and beyond or using the car shuttle to reach somewhere like Le Touquet, an hour's drive from Eurotunnel's Calais terminal. Tunnel tourists help keep the wheels moving for small businesses, including this one.
I drive the little train. Lots of English people come at the weekend, in cars, in the shuttle. It's very good.
Plenty of Brits swing by the town's golf course.
Every year we've got 45,000 visitors, and basically 20,000 of those visitors are English people.
Charles thinks the shorter journey compared to ferries means a longer holiday.
An extra round of golf, so that's more fun for them and more business for us.
The tunnel's financial journey hasn't always been smooth. It opened £2 billion over budget. At one point, the company which runs it nearly went bust. Predicted passenger numbers were never reached, but Eurotunnel became profitable. More recently, new challenges. The pandemic and Brexit meant putting millions into new systems to deal with additional customs rules. Eurotunnel is building an area to cope with the EU's new border system starting this October.
The crossing time will be extended by 5 to maximum 7 minutes for each customers. And as we have extended the number of lanes, there will be no delay on the highway, nothing.
And that report by our transport correspondent. A watch that the late US President John F. Kennedy once lost at cards is to be auctioned at Christie's in New York on Monday, with some reports saying it could sell for as much as $2 million. As Alison Davis reports, the timepiece has had a checkered history since it left JFK's wrist in the early 1940s.
The gold-plated Swiss-made Bulova watch began its life as a Christmas present to the 25-year-old JFK in 1942, with a date and his initials engraved on the back. But its time with JFK was short-lived, leaving him when he reportedly lost a game of cards. So started a life of changing wrists, descending from the promising high with the future president to, in 1998, a Boston pawn shop. It was bought by a German tourist for a reported $280, who then sold it to the Austrian watch specialist Heinrich Huttner. He saw it had potential, but couldn't prove that it had belonged to John F. Kennedy. Then, after years of research, he got access to an archive of some 5,000 photos of the Kennedy family in the early 1940s. Mr. Huttner pored through them one by one, and finally one photo emerged. It shows a young JFK staring at the camera with, on his wrist, the Bulova. The photo is Heinrich Huttner's key to potentially $2 million. The starting price at the auction, $720,000. He is quoted as saying that without it, the watch was worth nothing. Now it's worth a fortune.
The ancient Egyptians may have had a greater medical understanding than one might think. Researchers in Europe say that marks and cuts on a more than 4,000-year-old skull suggest they were trying to treat cancer. Edgard Camaros led the research, which has been published in the journal Frontiers in Medicine. He spoke to Tim Franks.
What we saw is not just the lesion of a cancer, of a neoplastic pathology, but it's also the evidence that more than 4,000 years ago, during the period that we know the ancient Egyptians, they performed a surgical intervention. And this is actually quite a milestone in the history of medicine, because it's telling us that these people had some kind of interest in trying to understand and maybe, who knows, trying to treat cancer.
And you think it was surgery, you think it was treatment, you don't think this was an autopsy?
Well, we know for sure it was an oncological surgery. However, the cut marks, we cannot scientifically say they were made with the patient alive or with the individual already dead. And that's why we call them perimortem cut marks. However, that's very interesting in both of these scenarios, because if the individual was alive, then that's probably a surgical intervention, maybe searching for some kind of treatment. However, if the individual was already dead, that might be related with some kind of medical autopsy, some kind of exploratory intervention. However, in both of the cases, it is certainly a surgical intervention in relation to that tumour.
And how did you know that there was a tumour there? What makes you certain that it was cancer?
We've performed some micro-CT, TAC scans. We did also some microscopic observations. And the features that we found on those lesions, the bone pathologies, are very, very characteristics of what we nowadays call cancer or neoplastic diseases. And that's why our diagnosis is related with cancer.
We do tend to think of cancers as being a more recent type of disease. So is that important, do you think?
That's important. And it's true that people tend to think that cancer is a modern disease. However, we obviously know that cancer, it's related to life. It's related to multicellular life. So actually cancer has been with life since the very beginning of it. But it's true that the incidence of cancer is very, very high nowadays. However, the more we look into our past, the more we find that cancer was really a prevalent disease.
The Egyptians, I mean, I think we knew that they were quite advanced when it came to medicine, but this presumably would be a big leap forward in that.
It is a leap forward, but actually it's interesting to think that there's a context for this surgical intervention, and that's the very advanced and sophisticated ancient Egyptian medicine. We've got, for example, the papyrus, which is a different kind of source rather than bones to try and understand this kind of medicine. And those papyrus, for example, the Edwin Smith papyrus, which dates about 3,600 years ago, they already describe 48 cases of different conditions, but the very interesting case is number 45, which it seems is describing a breast cancer. And the fascinating thing is that whenever they try and say what could have been the treatment for that, they say there's no cure, there's no treatment available for that. And this is interesting because although there's amazing medicine, they really had this frontier in their medical knowledge when it comes to what we nowadays call cancer. But they did identify tumours, etc.
Professor Edgard Camaros from the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain.
For thousands of years, it's been one of the world's great mysteries just how were the pyramids in Egypt built. Now, scientists say they think they've solved the mystery of how dozens of pyramids, including the world-famous Giza complex, were constructed. They've discovered a long-lost and ancient branch of the River Nile, which is now hidden under desert and farmland, using surveys, satellite imagery, old maps and sediment samples. They say the waterway would have been used to float stone blocks. Suzanne Onstein is an associate professor at the University of Memphis and co-wrote the study.
We have evidence that they used the river as transport for large things like obelisks. They dragged huge stones and statues on that kind of log system, and getting all of that heavy stuff as close as possible to the building site. And that includes not just stones, but massive amounts of food to support the population, grain and meats and vegetables from all over for the work crews. So there's a lot of stuff other than just the heavy building stones that those harbors and access to the river would have been important for.
So what are the big unanswered questions about the pyramids that archaeologists are still trying to find out?
We have all of these sort of little pieces of evidence that we can string together to speak about the building of the pyramids, that some of the stone was quarried nearby, that some of it was being delivered from the Red Sea, that some of it's quarried further south. But there's no smoking gun instruction manual that says first you drag a stone here and then you build a ramp and then you drag it up the ramp and put it on top. There are pyramids with different construction styles in this whole stretch of pyramids. So we can't really say that there's only one way that this happened.
Suzanne Onstein, associate professor at the University of Memphis, speaking to Alex Ritz. The pyramids of Giza in Egypt are one of the world's most famous archaeological wonders. Constructed more than 4,000 years ago to house the tombs of the country's pharaohs, they're visited by millions of tourists every year. Now, the Egyptian government has started a project to cover one of the pyramids with granite blocks and restore it to what it says was its original state. But the plan has alarmed many experts concerned about what this will do to the ancient structure, and there's been a storm of criticism on social media. Our correspondent in Cairo, Sally Nabil, told me more.
It's a project between Egypt and Japan aiming to cover the smallest pyramid in granite. It's supposed to take 3 years. The government describes it as the project of the century, and it says that it will make the smallest pyramid even more attractive to visitors from different parts of the world. And once this news was spread, it caused an uproar on social media, because people were becoming very, very suspicious about this so-called restoration process. Back thousands and thousands of years ago, when the pyramids were first built, it was believed that they were originally covered in granite that was eaten up over the years. So, given this uproar, now there are reports that say that a committee will be formed that will carry out further research and studies to see if this is a viable project and if work can continue on site.
And can you explain to us why there's been this uproar and indeed why Japan is involved?
Actually, why Japan is involved, this is a question that no one has answered. But we know that they have allocated some money for this project, and generally speaking, the government do not really release much information to the public. They do not give details at all. So the project has outraged a lot of people and a lot of archaeologists as well, because the Egyptian government has history of what experts say messing up with archaeological sites. Critics say that this government has already knocked down a huge number of historic tombs, that some of them are 1,000 years old, to make way for building roads and building bridges and expanding some infrastructure project. And they did not really care about the UNESCO certified tombs. So that given that this is the history of this government, a lot of people say that they won't handle the restoration process of the small pyramid with care. And some even said that this pyramid might eventually fall. And they likened this restoration process to straightening the Pisa Tower, for example, in Italy. The way the government has been justifying it is that when the project has been concluded, it will attract even more tourists from around the world. And for this country, tourism is a lifeline to the Egyptian economy, which is already struggling.
Now, when you think of huge dinosaurs, you may conjure up images of magnificent and sometimes terrifying creatures that once roamed the earth. But there were some equally impressive sea creatures too, including one called the ichthyosaur, which looked a bit like a cross between a dolphin and a whale. Now, 200 million years after they became extinct, a fossil of a jawbone measuring more than 2 metres has been found on the coast of southwest England. Scientists believe, based on the size of the jawbone, the whole animal was 25 metres long. That's bigger than previously thought. Our science reporter, Jordina Ranard, told me more about this discovery.
We're actually talking about two different groups of fossils which were found by these amateur fossil hunters in the UK. They found them when they were digging around in the mud on the beach. And they're fossilised jawbones. I saw the pieces earlier today. They were found over a number of years, and now scientists have analysed the specimens, and they've concluded they were from this marine reptile, the gigantic ichthyosaur. And when you compare those jawbones to other marine reptiles that were maybe the size of orcas or dolphins that we might know, it's absolutely massive. And scientists use that to estimate just how big its body was. And to find out more about this, I was speaking to a paleontologist, Dean Lomax at the University of Bristol.
This discovery is hugely important because not only do we now have two of these giant jawbones, we could now work out that they belong to this ancient giant ichthyosaur that we've called Ichthyotitan sevenensis. This animal lived about 202 million years ago, right before this major extinction event that wiped out this group of animals. So we know that these ichthyosaurs become truly gigantic right up until their extinction.
Georgina, briefly, you've been speaking to the fossil finders. Do they think they're going to find more?
Well, they hope so, and partly because that would actually help them narrow down just how big it was. They think it's the largest ever, but what they really want is a complete skull or skeleton. They told me it is really rare to find these things, but anyone can do it, and this discovery is testimony to the power of these amateur fossil hunters who spend all their time digging around in the mud on beaches or in quarries and manage to find these types of amazing.
Not every day that you find an archaeological treasure in your back garden, but that's what happened to 55-year-old geography teacher Graham Senior when he was clearing weeds and stones at his home in Coventry in the English Midlands. Not far below the surface of the soil, he came across a rectangular rock about 11 centimetres or 4 inches long. It's believed to be more than 1,600 years old and is inscribed in a rare ancient language called Ogham, also known as Ogham. Tim Franks heard from the archaeologist Teresa Gilmore from Birmingham Museums and first from Graham himself, who quite quickly realised he'd found something very special.
I looked at it and it had been clearly marked down one edge, and it was far too regular a mark for it to have been made by an animal or it for it to have occurred naturally. I thought at first it was some kind of calendar, and I think I remember sharing that with Teresa, but it turned out to be a script called Ogham, which I'd never heard of before.
At what point did people start getting very excited?
But I get the impression Teresa got quite excited pretty much straight away.
Well, let's in that case bring Teresa in here. Teresa, you're the expert in all this. Tell me what your first contact with this stone was.
I think Graham called me to start with and said, I found this rock, I think it's calendar stone. And I said, OK,
send me some photos. And when the photos came through, I saw the markings down the side and recognised that, yes, they were regular, they'd been man-made, but it was of a particular type of writing called Ogham. It's normally Irish style, but we don't get them in the Midlands. They're normally kind of over in Ireland, up in Scotland, down in Cornwall area. When I thought it was Ogham, I sent it to Catherine Forsyth up at Glasgow University, one of the country's leading experts on Ogham, and she pretty much confirmed very, very quickly that it was definitely Ogham, and it was a very important find.
And how old do we think the stone is?
We think it's probably 5th to 6th century, but it could be as early as the 4th century.
And have you been able to read the script?
Catherine has done a translation, and she's translated it as Mal Dumcail S. Lass. So the first part of the inscription is actually someone's name, Male Dumcail. The second part, the S. Lass, we're still trying to interpret that. It might be a location of where the person's from, or it could be their occupation. We don't know at this point in time.
Were you aware that people from Ireland were travelling to this part of England?
Not really. So the fantastic thing about this is it's giving us more evidence in our archaeological jigsaw puzzle of how people did move around the area. And it's just showing how people are moving from one country to another, how trade is happening, and this case of how you're getting different contacts.
Teresa Gilmore from Birmingham Museums and teacher.
Remarkable new archaeological research suggests that our species might be quite a bit older than previously thought. If so, it could mean that for several millennia, our forebears, those early Homo sapiens, shared the Earth with Neanderthals. 2 new research papers with material from a site in central Germany have updated our understanding of our biological inheritance. Professor Chris Stringer is a researcher in human evolution at the Natural History Museum here in London.
We and the Neanderthals had like a parallel evolution over hundreds of thousands of years, us in Africa, them in Europe and Asia. And then about 60,000 years ago, we think Homo sapiens started to emerge and start to head towards Europe. But we thought that our species didn't really get into Europe until about 41,000 years ago, with only a very short overlap with the Neanderthals before they disappeared. But this new work from Rannis, which looks at a site that was, dug nearly 100 years ago, they've gone back to the site and made remarkable discoveries that there were Homo sapiens at this site making an unusual stone tool industry called the Rannisian with laurel-shaped spear points. So no one knew who made those spear points. We didn't know if it was late Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens. But the new work using DNA has shown that it clearly was Homo sapiens there at a date of 45,000 years. There were many forms of humans, and people even use that term differently. But yes, I regard them as different kinds of humans, and there were at least 5 kinds around in the last 100,000 years, and we're the last ones left. And so what's obviously one of the big questions is, why is that? What happened to the others? But this would suggest that there was a significant period of overlap between the last Neanderthals and the first Homo sapiens in Europe, and they coexisted for a period of time. They did a bit of interbreeding. Maybe they even shared ideas with each other. And what's interesting is these Rannis people were already adapting to very cold conditions, and that's surprising too. We thought it took a while for Homo sapiens to manage to do that.
Professor Chris Stringer. It is best known for use in the bedroom, but Viagra could have another rather important side effect. Researchers from University College London found that men who took such drugs were 18% less likely to develop Alzheimer's. Professor Tara Spires-Jones is president of the British Neuroscience Association and has been looking at the study.
This is a great study, very large and well conducted, with looking at over 250,000 men. There have been previous studies that similarly showed people taking this type of drug called phosphodiesterase type 5 inhibitors had a reduced risk of dementia. And already some work has been done in animals and in humans showing how this drug might be helping protect the brain. So it does open the door and make it even more important that we keep following this.
I'm fascinated. I'm told that what this is called is a confounding factor in research. In other words, that, there may be something else going on. If you wanted a control study to check whether it's the pill or the sex life, as it were, that's making the difference to the health of people's brains, is there a way of easily isolating that factor?
Easily, no, but certainly there's a way, and the authors of the study propose a great idea, which is to follow this up with an actual randomized control trial where you give people randomly either the drug at different doses or a placebo. And of course, we'd want to test women and men, right, to be sure that this sort of treatment, which helps your vasculature as well as your sex life, can be protective in the brain. So yeah, a randomized control trial would be an excellent way of testing.
I think what's fascinating about this is the idea of looking at existing pharmaceuticals to see whether they can help, alongside, obviously, some very important work to look at completely new drugs.
Absolutely. So in the field, we call that drug repurposing. And sometimes you'll get lucky, and one of the drugs that's already approved for something like, in this case, erectile dysfunction, and also is used to treat some types of hypertension, might also be protecting the brain. But as a field, we look at both ends, right? We look at whether things that already exist and are already approved can help people. And we're also looking at what's happening in the brain at a detailed level so we can develop new, very targeted treatments.
So finally, if new studies are needed, are we months from an answer or probably many years?
Oh, years for this. So a randomized trial is very expensive and takes quite a long time. So yes, it would be years before we know for sure whether this treatment would be a prevention for dementia.
Professor Tara Spars-Jones from the University of Edinburgh talking to the BBC's Nick. Of the largest Stegosaurus ever found have smashed the world record paid for a dinosaur skeleton. Named Apex, the 150-million-year-old remains fetched $44.6 million at a Sotheby's auction in New York. James Reed reports.
There were gasps and applause in the auction house as the bids for Apex rose higher and higher. The final price was 10 times more than predicted, and a third more than the previous record for a dinosaur, paid for a Tyrannosaurus rex in 2020. Measuring 8 metres long, the Stegosaurus is one of the most complete skeletons ever found. It comes with dorsal plates and the spiked tail it used to defend itself from predators. The fossil was unearthed 2 years ago in the US state of Colorado. The identity of the buyer has not yet been made public. In recent years, super-rich private collectors have often outbid museums, to the dismay of scientists.
James Reed.
It's not the end, but maybe it's the beginning of the end. For years, Parisians have grown accustomed to the cranes and the scaffolding creeping ever higher over the shell of Notre Dame. Now the process has reversed, and the scaffolding is slowly, painstakingly coming down, revealing today, like a receding tide, just the very pinnacle of the new spire, surmounted by a cross, and on top of that, a statuette of a golden cock, just like the one that disappeared in the blaze. For Philippe Just, president of the Notre Dame Renovation Agency, it's a powerful moment.
People are impatient to see the cathedral rebuilt, and this impatience is increasing as we get closer to the opening. The fall of the spire was the most dramatic moment of the fire, so to see the spire finally rebuilt, it's like the healing of a wound.
The spire is made from oak beams, and the last task of the craftsmen and women on the scaffolding is cladding the wood in lead, the soft metal malleable enough to show the art that's gone into the carpentry. After this, the rest of the wooden roof, the forest as it's known in French, will need to be covered, and there are new safety mechanisms to be installed, like water sprayers to cut the risk of another fire. After the conflagration, they gave themselves 5 years to get the restoration completed. It seemed ambitious, but it looks like they might come in on time.
Hugh Schofield.
Scientists at Cambridge University have recreated the face of a Neanderthal woman who lived 75,000 years ago. The lifelike model was built from a crushed skull discovered in a cave in Kurdistan, where the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals have been found since the 1950s. Scientists think she may have been in her mid-40s, a considerable age at that point. James Copnell spoke to Dr. Emma Pomeroy, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Cambridge, who worked on the project.
Our role here was in making the physical reconstruction of the skull. And then the Kenneth brothers, who are fabulous paleo artists, have done the reconstruction of what she would have looked like during life. But just to reconstruct the skull was a huge challenge. It was completely crushed. It was about 2 centimetres thick in total and highly fragmented. The bone was very soft. So we had to remove the bone from the ground in small packages and then very carefully clean that in the lab, add a consolidant, which is kind of like a glue that helps to stabilize the bone and make it strong enough to work with, and then set about the quite daunting task of physically fitting those bits of the bone back together.
What does this then reveal about the person who died so many years ago?
We're learning a lot from the skull itself, and this is actually work that's ongoing, but we can already say, well, we know that she's female. We can also say that she was older when she died, so her teeth were really worn down. I mean, the teeth at the front, she's got no crown left to the white part. They're worn right down to little stubs of the roots. We could also learning about her health. So, for example, she had gum disease and the gums would have been starting to recess. We can see also things like signs of arthritis in her neck. So very exciting to start learning about this person. The physical reconstruction, so what she would have looked like in life, is also quite fascinating because I think it helps us to think of her as a person and brings up some different questions about what she might have been like and what her life might have been like.
And are there things that have surprised you then in this work over the last couple of years?
Yes, I mean, various things. One of the most interesting points, I think, is that Shandar Z is actually part of a really tight cluster of Neanderthal individuals found in the cave. And that's very intriguing because the cave is huge, and yet within sort of 1.5 meters by 1 meter by 50 centimeters deep, we've got the remains of at least 5 individuals. So that starts raising questions. I don't think it can be coincidence in such a big space. So does this have some kind of meaning? Are they returning to that same spot? And actually we're getting some evidence that the bodies were brought there or placed there at different times. So again, it raises this question of whether Neanderthals had sort of special places and how they thought about death and the landscape around them.
I mean, would that suggest a sort of more empathy, emotion than one might have associated with Neanderthals?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, from sort of the earliest days back to the 19th century when Neanderthals were first identified, there was this idea that they were sort of your archetypal cavemen, not very intelligent and not capable of things like compassion and very complex emotions. But in more recent years, that idea has been challenged. And actually the finds here from Shandar Cave have been really instrumental in that. And the new finds will play an important part in us trying to understand their capacity for compassion and how they might have dealt with death.
Doctor, end this edition of the Global News podcast with the story of an 18th century Spanish warship. Rather more than 300 years ago, the ship known as the San Jose was attacked by a British warship off the coast of South America. The San Jose sank to the bottom of the sea, taking with it treasure now worth billions of dollars. 9 years ago, the wreck was rediscovered, sparking another battle, this time over who owned it, and more crucially, the treasure on board. Now the Colombian government has declared the site a protected archaeological area. Ella Bicknell reports.
For more than 300 years, the location of the San Jose was unknown, thought to be in Davy Jones' locker, lost in an oceanic abyss. It was a 64-gun, 3-masted galleon, a mainstay of the Spanish Armada. That was until it was sunk by the British in 1708 off the coast of what is now Colombia. On board, 600 sailors and a treasure trove of gold, silver and emeralds, as well as 11 million pesos in coins. The wreck and its treasure, found in 2015, are estimated to be worth billions of dollars, which is why it's been embroiled in legal disputes over ownership. Spain insisted the bounty was its, since it was a Spanish warship and Spanish soldiers lost at sea. But Bolivia's indigenous Cara nation say the treasure belongs to them, as their ancestors were forced to mine the precious metals. Even an American salvage company wants a piece, claiming it first spotted the vessel more than 40 years ago.
This isn't just a treasure with economic value, it's more than that. It has cultural importance.
That's Colombia's Minister of Culture, Juan Correa. He says the discovery has been marred by greed, today declaring a protected archaeological area around the site.
This galleon signifies a crossing of cultures, history and memories which includes the original people of Latin America, and also the genocide that happened there, the enslaving of thousands and thousands of people, human beings, who were brought here from Africa under the worst conditions imaginable.
Next, Colombia will hope to launch a deep-water expedition involving a remotely operated robot diving to the depths of 600 metres, taking photos of the wreckage for scientific research. Scientists say they have no plans to take samples, promising a non-invasive operation. Any salvage will come later. For now, the treasure will stay buried.
Now, how do you like your eggs in the morning? Well, probably a bit fresher than this one. After unearthing it during an archaeological dig over a decade ago, UK scientists have discovered that a 1,700-year-old egg still contains liquid. The revelation makes it the only intact egg from Roman Britain and the oldest egg ever discovered that wasn't deliberately preserved. Edward Biddulph from Oxford Archeology led the excavation in southern England. Tim Franks asked him about the significance of this discovery.
The egg was actually excavated a while ago in 2010 as part of an excavation on a housing development, and the egg was found in a waterlogged pit. And when conditions are right, then organic objects which don't normally survive can survive, like wooden objects and leather and things like that. And the site was part of a Roman town just outside Aylesbury. So it was a reasonably large-sized town, and this waterlogged pit, which had been used to extract water for malting and brewing, it's still very wet when we excavate it. And it seems that the Roman people had, after the pit had been used for malting and brewing, used it to throw in coins and other objects as offerings to the gods. And they included these eggs. There were two other eggs with this one. Unfortunately, two disintegrated on exposure to the air, but we managed to recover one. So normally these things don't survive. I mean, if we do find eggs, Roman period eggs, it's usually as eggshell, but not as a whole egg. And so that itself is amazing that we managed to recover this egg. Now, several years down the line, we did all the post-excavation analysis and published the results. But we had to think about the long-term storage of this egg. And this is where the conservator we work with, Dana Goodburn-Brown, did a micro-CT scan of the egg because we had to know quite what we were dealing with. And the scan just showed it contained a liquid.
So what you're going to presumably introduce an extremely narrow needle in a syringe in a very controlled environment to ensure that it doesn't shatter.
Yes, we're still making arrangements to look into the possibility of doing this, and a very fine hole can be made into the egg and the liquid extracted.
Have you any idea what bird it might be? Have you got any theories?
Well, we think it's a chicken's egg. That hasn't been confirmed because chickens were actually quite important in the Roman world. Apart from just being a food source, they were used for sacrifice or for ritual feasts and things like that. And so it makes sense for it to be a chicken's egg. And a superficial examination of the egg suggests that it may well be. And when the other two eggs with it sort of shattered on exposure to air, they did emit eggy smells. We think that the contents still have something of the original content. Absolutely nobody really has the chance to deal with something that's quite so old and still in this level of preservation. So actually there's a story that just continues to run as we find more and more out about the egg. I mean, of course, there are older preserved eggs, perhaps in Egypt, for instance, mummified eggs, but this wasn't intended to be preserved.
Is it putting it too strongly, Edward, to say that archaeologists are going to sort of have to rethink how they excavate? Because obviously if you'd just gone in with your normal excavating tools, it may not have survived.
Of course, we do have a range of methods to deal with all sorts of conditions, and it's not all with a massive digger and big tools to excavate. But it does make you aware of what could survive. It is a reminder, really, to that we have to be prepared for anything, really.
For many people here in the UK who watched the last night of The Proms, the annual series of mainly classical music concerts in London, the singing of Rule Britannia is an essential part of the evening. But critics of the 18th century song believe it's antiquated because of its associations with colonialism, slavery and the British Empire. Sheku Kane-Mason, the British cellist who found international fame when he performed at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, has told the BBC that Rule Britannia shouldn't be performed anymore at the last night of the Proms. Noor Nanji reports.
There was fierce criticism in 2020 when it emerged that Rule Britannia would not be sung at the Proms. The BBC had blamed the move on COVID-19 restrictions, but later backtracked. Sheku Kane-Mason was a soloist at the last night of the Proms last year. But he said he did not stay to hear Rule Britannia being sung. He told BBC Radio 4's Desert Island Disc the song made a lot of people feel uncomfortable and suggested British folk music could replace it at the event.
Sporting a light blue suit, a pink rose and his military medal, a gleeful Harold Terrans walked down the aisle towards his bride. The 100-year-old from Florida was in Normandy for D-Day celebrations, where he served as a radio technician, assisting fighter pilots in the skies over northern France. He wanted to commemorate the event by marrying his 96-year-old fiancée, Jean Swerlin. They tied the knot in the small town of Carentan-les-Marais, near the very beaches the Allies landed on 80 years ago.
My religion is love. I believe in love. I taught my family, wherever they go, just love.
Mr. Terrans was awarded the French Legion of Honour by President Macron in 2019. During the war, he was also part of a secret mission that took him to Soviet Ukraine via Casablanca, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Cairo, Baghdad, as well as Tehran. But he said Normandy will always have a place in his heart.
The best time of my entire life. I'm 100 years old and my bride is 96. Normandy is my second favourite place in the whole world.
Both widowed, Harold and Jean were introduced to each other by a friend in 2021. The two have been inseparable ever since.
I waited 96 years to find the right guy. Well, better late than never, right? I mean, it's not just for young people, love, you know. We get butterflies and we get a little action also.
After a modest 1940s-themed reception, next stop for the newlyweds, Paris, for a dinner with Presidents Biden and Macron.
Our earlier edition of this podcast about the discovery of a huge city in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. For thousands of years, it was hidden under a vast canopy of green in the Upano area of eastern Ecuador. The researchers found that the houses and plazas were connected by an astounding network of roads and canals. Experts say it's hugely significant and suggest some ancient civilizations in the Amazon rainforest were more sophisticated. The city lay in the shadow of a volcano which could have ultimately led to its destruction. Manuel Arroyo Calin from the Institute of Archeology at University College London is an expert on the region of South America where the discovery was made. He spoke to Anita Anand.
Oh, I'm very, very excited. We have known about the Upano Valley findings for some time, but we have never seen them displayed in the way that they're being shown now by the application of new airborne technology. And the scale at which they're shown today and the arguments that are being put together in the recent paper that is being published in Science begins to tie a number of aspects that allow us to look at contemporaneity, connectivity, landscape modification and intensification. It's fascinating.
Okay, it's hard, isn't it? When you've got a rainforest, you've got such thick growth over the top. How have they seen these roads and these pathways?
Yes, so it's the application of technology known as LiDAR. That's laser detection and ranging. It works by laser pulses from an airborne vehicle. The laser pulses are pulsed at millimetric distances, and they reach, if you fly on top of a forest, they reach either the leaves or the floor. And so then through data processing, we clean off those pulses that never reach the floor, and we're left with a contour-shaped image of the ground under the rainforest canopy. So that is millimetric in precision and can allow you to see ditches, mounds.
What is so exciting about this is we're talking about permanent structures, permanent civilizations, if you like, in a place where it has always been assumed that people have been somewhat nomadic, moving with the seasons. How does it sort of match the time of this ancient civilization with what else was going on around the world?
If you compare it to what is happening in the Amazon basin, 2,500 years BP, so that's about 500 BC, is a significant time because at that time we are only beginning to see the inklings of other landscape modifications of a similar size or similar scale in other parts, but not necessarily in Amazonia itself. There are some earlier developments in other parts of South America, notably in the Peruvian semi-arid coast and then also in Ecuador. And indeed, if you compare it to some of the findings in Europe and Asia and Africa, timings are different. It's a big world.
Yeah, it is a big world. I mean, just very briefly, is it too soon to suppose what these people might have been like, looked like, lived like?
In short, yes. I mean, archaeologists working in the Americas start with the impact of European colonization as a process. We know the people that lived there at the time that Europeans arrived, and we know the descendants of those people. There's records. But as soon as you push back 1,500 years from that timeline, the people that are there are most likely the forebears of some of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon today, but we don't know precisely whom, so we will refer to them as different cultural groups as described by archaeology. Yet at this site, some of the groups that occupy the location around 900 AD are connected to some of the indigenous groups of Ecuador today, and they might in themselves claim that their great-great-grandparents built these sites.
Manuel Arroyo Calin from the Institute of Archaeology.
The BBC has learned that the FBI has been investigating the sale to US buyers of hundreds of treasures the British Museum believes were stolen from its collection. The museum confirmed in August that a large number of objects were missing. A police investigation continues here in the UK. Here's our culture editor, Katie Razzle.
Is a pencil? Shouldn't it be a pen?
I'm in a wood-panelled staff room inside the British Museum with the Danish antiquities dealer, Dr. Itai Gradell.
It is a pen. I promise you it's not a pencil.
Oh, right, you're right.
Rub it out.
He's sitting next to Professor Tom Harrison, who's leading the museum's recovery programme. And he's signing more than 350 ancient gemstones over to the museum, items they and he believe were stolen.
I haven't practiced it from home. I'm sure you haven't.
Itai bought hundreds of gems in good faith over many years, mainly through the online auction site eBay and via another dealer. The museum's announcement last August about missing, stolen and damaged items wasn't news to Dr. Gradell. He had first tried to warn more than 2 years before that he believed a curator was stealing from its collection. He was brushed off by the museum several times. Former Chancellor George Osborne is the chair of trustees. Was there an effort made to protect the reputation of the museum? People have called it a cover-up.
I absolutely reject that. There are people who made mistakes, there are people who may have been naive, but there was no deliberate attempt to conceal from the public what had happened.
The museum claims its curator, Dr. Peter Higgs, who's been sacked, sold its treasures to at least 45 buyers on eBay. Peter Higgs denies any wrongdoing. The police are investigating. But since the story broke, we've been on the hunt for hundreds of treasures that appear scattered across the world. Itai Gradell has located objects he sold on in Hamburg, Cologne, Hong Kong and Paris, where I joined him for a handover of 4 gems. What a place.
Okay.
It's the moment.
Yeah, there they are.
We've also found 2 gems on display in a temporary exhibition in another museum in a small town in Germany. That museum would have had no idea that they may have been stolen. And we've discovered that the FBI has been investigating sales made in the US.
I got an email from the FBI. I was completely shocked. I don't want any trouble.
That's Tonio Berbiglia, a former gem dealer based in New Orleans. He told us an FBI agent contacted him about items he'd bought on eBay.
I didn't have anything to hide. I gladly spoke with him.
We've since established that Tonio bought 2 gems, one depicting the god of desire Cupid, the other the Egyptian god Anubis.
That was when I was working for a really big antique store, which is known for big antiques in New Orleans. And they had specific clients that were looking for things like seals and things like that.
Tonio hasn't heard anything from the FBI since then, but we understand the US law enforcement agency located more than 260 gems believed to have come from the British Museum that were bought by a private collector in Washington, D.C. We believe those gems are now back at the museum. But the museum's recovery programme is hindered by a lack of cataloguing. It doesn't have a record of many of the items, which means the museum hasn't yet been able to prove they were actually stolen. Professor Harrison replaced Peter Higgs as the head of the Greece and Rome department.
We're looking at the registers, old archive material, which includes receipts, lists that were made before the items came here.
The museum will now spend £10 million fully cataloguing its collection, and it says it's on its way to recovering almost half of what it estimates is missing. But it's likely gold jewellery and other items have already been melted down.
Vatican City is considered one of the finest examples of high Renaissance art. Its walls and ceiling adorned with Michelangelo frescoes. But the draw of its beauty has been its undoing, it seems. 6 million tourists visit every year, and they're having a big impact on the artworks. The BBC went behind the scenes to meet the small team of experts protecting them. Sarah Monetta reports.
You are kindly requested to remain silent.
A stunned crowd slowly paces on the inlaid marble floor, their eyes on the vault, their mouths half opened in amazement. The Sistine Chapel is part of one of the most visited museums in the world, up to 25,000 tourists a day, but that comes at a price. So for a few weeks every year, after the last visitor is gone, experts get to work.
If you imagine thousands of people, contemporary, present in the chapel, this means that the humidity increases and also the carbon dioxide. And this reacts with the surface of the work of art.
Francesca Persagati is the head of the painting lab at the Vatican Museums.
We may have condensation, is like water on the surface, dust deposit, because dust means also dangerous compounds.
Climbing onto a crane operated from the ground, Francesca is lifted high up under the vault, just a few centimeters away from the image of Jesus raising his arm. She and her team are inspecting the scene of the Last Judgment to spot any signs of deterioration.
We have here some alterations, some light whitening. Now we need to understand what caused it.
At the opposite end of the chapel, experts on a scaffolding are taking high-resolution photos to map sections of the frescoes. Fabio Moresi is the head of the scientific lab. He shows me a stunningly detailed close-up of a character in a sidewall fresco. It's a self-portrait of Perugino, the author of the scene.
To get these details, we took 20 separate photos and we pieced them back together to obtain this extremely high-resolution image. At such high resolution, we can see down the single paint crystal, and this allows us to see over time if there have been changes or dust deposits.
After the last restoration 30 years ago, sensors and an air conditioning system were installed to keep a stable environment in the chapel. But since then, the number of visitors has soared, requiring more intensive maintenance.
Last year, we closed our 2023 with nearly 7 million people in a year.
Barbara Iatta is the director of the Vatican Museums.
It's an important mission to be an open house. It's exactly what Pope Francis is asking to us, and it's exactly the line in which we are going, trying to balance, of course, the welcoming with the preservation of our incredible collections that are surrounding us.
It's a fine line to ensure that present and future generations will still be able to gasp in awe every time they look up at Michelangelo's masterpiece.
Sarah Monetta at the Sistine Chapel.
Individuals to have left his mark on American views of the Vietnam War has died. Lieutenant William Calley commanded a US Army platoon that carried out one of the worst war crimes in American military history. Eventually, in 2009, 41 years after the events, he said he was sorry. Mark Duff looks back at the man and the massacre that won him notoriety.
And so the helicopters put down and we jumped out and still hear a lot of firing going. I thought, holy cow, this is really a hot zone. But, a couple minutes later, we realized we were not being fired at.
Ron Heberley was a battle-hardened frontline war photographer when he landed with American troops outside the hamlet of My Lai in March 1968. Even he was shocked by what he saw that day.
It just complete carnage in the village. Just unreal scenes happening. I mean, the hooches were burning. There was dead people laying in some of the hooches. There was people, on the trail. I think the weirdest thing was some of the soldiers were jumping on some of the animals, the water buffaloes, with their bayonets, trying to stab them. And just a complete, freak-out scene. But still, to this day, I still can't really figure it out.
Soldiers under the command of Lieutenant William Calley killed 504 people as they conducted a search and destroy operation against Viet Cong communist guerrillas. Nearly all of the victims were civilians. The killings shocked a United States already divided by the war and galvanised the growing anti-war movement. Cali was charged with killing 102 men, women and children. He was eventually convicted of 22 deaths. At his court-martial, he made this defence of his actions.
If I have committed a crime, the only crime that I have committed is in judgment of my values. Apparently, I valued my troops' lives more than I did that of the enemy. When my troops were getting massacred and mauled by an enemy I couldn't see, I couldn't feel, and I couldn't touch, that nobody in the military system ever described as anything other than communism. They didn't give it a race, they didn't give it a sex, they didn't give it an age. They never let me believe it was just a philosophy in a man's mind. And that was my enemy out there.
For his crimes, he spent just 3 days behind bars before he was released under house arrest by President Richard Nixon. Cali always protested that he'd been made a scapegoat. For all that, he became a living symbol of the moral corruption that the war in Vietnam wrought on America's self-image.
Mark Dunn. Of a previously undiscovered part of Pompeii has revealed a sumptuous villa with floor-to-ceiling frescoes and stunning mosaic floors beneath volcanic debris. Archaeologists believe a rich, influential man who may have run for public office lived there. They also think he may have been the owner of a bakery next door where slaves were probably kept in what was virtually a prison. Our science editor Rebecca Morell is in Pompeii.
I've come to Pompeii. You can see Mount Vesuvius looming over this Roman city, which of course was buried by an eruption here 2,000 years ago. Now the biggest excavation in a generation is taking place, and it's really giving us a new glimpse at this city which has been frozen in time for so long. And there are so many extraordinary new finds here. Now I'm joined by Sophie Hay, an archaeologist at Pompeii. You're going to show me some of the amazing rooms which have been found. You're sort of looking down, aren't you? We're standing at ground level here.
We're still on top of all the Vesuvian eruption material, and at least 3-4 metres below us, we're at Roman ground level. And at the moment, we're looking into a 3-sided room, which would have once looked out through a sort of colonnaded portico into a garden area. And this big room is absolutely stunning. Its floor is covered with these black mosaic with little insets of coloured marble. So you can imagine that when it's really clean, the colours would have been amazing.
Going to go down a bit further into the excavation.
Yeah.
Let's head over. We're in a courtyard now, interior courtyard.
Yes, so this is a courtyard within a house, which is very common in the Roman period. They do inside and outside simultaneously. And the view, I have to say, is so dramatic. In front of us, at the far side of this courtyard, we have an opening which they haven't yet excavated, but sort of splurging out in a sort of torrent is this 3-metre high pile of lapilli, which is the little pumice stones that rain down on Pompeii for 18 hours. It's kind of surging through an open doorway. And on the top we have the layers of the pyroclastic flow which sealed Pompeii for good. And if you were still in the city then, you were dead.
I mean, this is basically the avalanche of gas and volcanic material which was moved very quickly across the town. We're going to head down a bit more because we're kind of heading from the opulent, this grand residence, into a commercial area. So Sophie, we're being quite careful about where we're treading, but here we've come into a bakery. It's here where we get a glimpse into the sort of darker side of Roman life?
Working in a bakery is not about the nice smell of freshly baked bread at all. For the slaves that work here, they're working pretty much 24 hours a day. It's not an easy life. The air would be thick with the dust of flour. Breathing would be an issue. Of course, it gets very hot, so that would be not nice. The slaves who work here have to live in a small room, and they found bars on the skylight to stop them escaping. So we've kind of described it as a prison bakery. People who are working here are held captive here until somebody lets them out. So it always sort of tugs at the heartstrings a little bit to find people and understand their story and do them justice. And I think that's our job as archaeologists, is to obviously treat them with respect, but do their story justice.
Dr. Sophie Hay with Rebecca. Plato, known as the father of Western philosophy, died around the year 348 BC. Unusually for an ancient thinker, nearly all of his works have survived. The exact location of his burial has always been a mystery, until now. With the help of artificial intelligence, Italian researchers claim to have found the long-lost grave of the Greek philosopher. Rebecca Wood has the story.
Wise men talk because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something. That's one of Plato's quotes, and one I'm hoping on this occasion the first part can apply. Arguably the greatest of all the Greek philosophers, Plato's works form the foundations of Western society. He was born a nobleman in ancient Greece, but rejected his social privilege to devote his life to philosophy. He wrote about love and government, ethics, friendship, law, and his writings set out the terms of much of what we call Western philosophy today. But, as with many illustrious figures of the ancient world, his burial place has been a subject of speculation. We know that he was buried at the Academy, a famous school founded by the philosopher in Athens, but the grounds are large and exactly where was a mystery. Here's where some charred papyrus comes in, the Herculaneum scrolls. They survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Italy in 79 AD. In their burnt state, though, the 2,000-year-old documents would crumble if anyone attempted to unroll them. But using computer technology and advanced artificial intelligence, researchers have been able to take a closer look. And it's this research by Graziano Ranocchia from the University of Pisa and his team that has pinpointed an exact location, a private garden in the Academy near to a sacred shrine to the Muses. The team believe they'll have the whole of the papyrus analysed by 2026, so perhaps I should leave them with some apt words from the man himself. No one should be discouraged who can make constant progress, even though it be slow.
Rebecca.
The ancient Maya city of Chichen Itza in Mexico has long been associated with human sacrifice, with hundreds of bones unearthed from temples, a sacred sinkhole and other underground caverns. It has long been thought that the victims were often young and female, but analysis of DNA of human remains has revealed something different, as James Reed reports.
The children were thrown into an underground water cistern in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula as an offering to the gods more than 1,000 years ago, part of a well-documented Maya practice of human sacrifice. Now, DNA extracted from 64 of them has shown that they were all boys. Some were brothers, and there were 2 sets of identical twins. Previous research and Spanish colonial accounts suggested the Maya favoured girls as sacrificial victims. The researchers think the boys may have been specifically selected as sibling pairs for sacrifice. Twins were regarded as auspicious in Maya cosmology, and subterranean waterways were seen as gateways to the land of the dead. Chichen Itza, with its mighty pyramids, was one of many great cities that rose and fell in the centuries before the Spanish conquest brought Maya civilization crashing down. But the study also found strong genetic continuity with the indigenous Maya who live in the area today. And their language and culture remain rooted in the traditions of their ancestors.
James Reed.